What's up, guys? Shawnthebro here, and today we are going to be going over Blockstun and additional blocking logic all in one. So we have blocking logic in our game, both manual and automatic, and we're getting a lot closer to these combat flow episodes. In fact, there's already one out, and I want to really solidify all of the combat. So all of our transitions, what states can go to where, and all these other things that fighting games do need to have to be functional. But before we can do some of this, I started doing it and I realized we still have a few spots that are, they're not where they could be, and we need to kind of upgrade them to get them to a point where we can use them and be comfortable with them and be confident in them. And so we have this idea of Blockstun where we have like this number of frames that gets applied to a hitbox, and when the character is blocking, they go into Blockstun. And that was technically working, but it was more of a theoretical concept in the case that we've used it in the past. We were kind of just setting the character state to be blocking for that number of frames, which is basically correct. All right, so let's look at this again. My computer's running a little slow with that anim BP open, but I just want to show you something. So in this attack, this create active hitbox attack, I have made Blockstun frames 400. So when I am going to hit my opponent here in a second, if we are looking at our character, then you will be able to notice that the number of stun frames will go to 400. And that's how it has been. That's nothing new to this episode. So let's say I do this, and you can see the numbers going down. Now, Blockstun would essentially mean, and of course it would never be nearly this high. It would just be a few frames so that you could have advantage over the other player, or rather that you could have disadvantage depending on the attacks they use and the block that you perform. Now, when we're doing our manual block like this, okay, if I am to take a hit while I'm here, so say I throw my block up, and I take this hit, I should receive the hit and receive the damage as I've done. Once the number of stun frames are up, I should be able to release the button, and the character should release the manual block, but not sooner than that. All right, and the reason I want to do that is that's how I envision manual block. So we'll need to adjust it a little bit more in the future to make it work as intended. For example, I should be able to be thrown from that state. Currently, I cannot because I don't have an anim BP transition rule between the two. And this is something, again, we will cover with the combat flow episode, so it's nothing to be concerned about. So now if I try and do a automatic block, that's basically if I'm walking away from my opponent and I get hit with a proximity box, I will trigger a block that will occur. And of course, I'll still take chip damage, whatever. You can see the number of frames going down on the right here. If I move this over, num stun frames. And that's how long the stun is because it's considered block stun. During this time, and the reason I've made it so large is because I want you to be able to see I can't do anything with that character during this time. This is what block stun is intended to do. Again, it's not necessarily intended to be 400 frames. It should only be a few frames. In fact, often it's less than your hit stun frames. So a successful block is usually more beneficial for the player than just taking a standard hit. And that makes sense. So that is what we want. But the other reason I'm trying to show you this today, so if I look at the character details, again, with the character state and the combo state. So if I am blocking, if I'm manually blocking and I take a hit, you can see I go from blocking and then my combo state is stun mid. That's got all 400 frames. So we have to wait for that one a bit. As soon as the combo state is done, we can release our manual block. But you saw that our character state was still blocking. Our combo state was putting us into block stun by giving us a stun mid. But our character state was still blocking because I was still holding it. Now, this round is going to end because timer ran out again. If we go over this one more time with the automatic block. So say I am to walk away from the opponent. You can see I'm forced into blocking and stun mid without ever manually blocking. They will then reset at the same time. And that's when we've exited Blockstun. So this is exactly what Blockstun is. We've actually managed to do it for both manual and automatic blocking in this case. All right, so we're going to be covering that in today's episode. And then we're going to be covering just a bunch of updates to blocking in general, because there were times when blocking would kick us out of a specific state that we're in and we didn't want it to, or it would not fire properly. It would kind of lock us into a state because it was waiting for, either release of a button or to take damage. We're going to fix all those issues today. What I'm going to do, now that you've seen that example, is reset the Blockstun frames. I'm going to put it to 4. Now, remember, these small amount of frames, these blocking animations are like probably several thousand frames. Like if I look at this, this one's only 106 frames. But it's a lot of frames when it should only be like 4 frames or so. So there's a lot of things that we're going to need to adjust, as we've spoken about. Okay. So let's get started on making our block actually work both manually and automatically, and also allowing this Blockstun mechanic to work as intended now with all of our new changes and all the changes in general that we've made since we made the blocking episodes, because that was quite some time ago. So if we go into our code and we go to our fighter template character, basically our base character. Now, before you watch this episode, if you would like to catch up on the entire series, this is episode 87. So we have been moving right along. We have an episode every Sunday, and we're making progress, and I'm very, very happy about it. If you'd like to catch up on the whole series and check it out, I'll leave an iCard right here to the playlist, and you can check out every episode we've done. Otherwise, it's okay if you don't want to check out the playlist, but I would recommend checking out the blocking logic first, because we are still going to be expanding upon what we had in the past in today's episode. All right. And so let's get into it today. All right. So first of all, for the combo state, I was debating if we needed a Blockstun state, and I decided that I don't believe we do. So Blockstun often, in most cases, will have a Blockstun low, Blockstun high, just like any of your other hit stun. And so you can, again, block low, block high, whatever. And because of that, I don't necessarily want to make like a Blockstun low, Blockstun high. We don't want too many states, not because there's really an issue with memory, because a lot of times there isn't in this case, but more so because of the fact that the more states we add, the more things we have to keep track of, and the more things where we can make mistakes. So as long as we do it intelligently, we can make this work. So essentially, Blockstun will be where the character state is set to blocking, and then the stun state is also set, or the combo state is also set to one of these stuns. Stun low, stun mid, or stun high. Stun mid, I don't believe, is often used too much for Blockstun, but we can use it if we want. We are not bound to any of the specific fighting game rules. I'm just trying to make it incorporate all of the common fighting game mechanics. That way you can go on and change it to your liking. So there you go. So if we're blocking as our character state, whether it's an automatic or manual, and we go to a stun, then we are in Blockstun. All right. Let's scroll down a bit, and we're going to add some new functions and some new variables to make our lives a lot easier. So first of all, we had a start blocking and a stop blocking. I've adjusted this now to make these separate functions for manual and automatic. You don't technically have to do this. One alternative is you could pass in a Boolean that says, bool is manual block, and then pass that in. And you can add parameters to your setup player input component function that determines if you are pressing the button. Because you can call start manually blocking, you could call start blocking, when you go to do an automatic block and just pass in false. But if you press the button to start manually blocking, you could pass in true. Now, it is worthwhile, we're here, so we should say this now. It's worthwhile to think about this. There's a very, very good chance you don't want to include both in your game. You should probably either have manual blocking or automatic blocking. So before we get into any of the code, you should probably make that choice. I'm including both because this is a a template, a tutorial series, and I want to show off both. For your game, you should probably only have one. And I'm going to be sticking more along the lines of the automatic block, which is when you're backing away and the game will block for you, assuming that you're doing the right command. So if it's a low attack and you crouch and hold back, then you crouch block. If it is a high attack, then when you're pressing backward, then you just regular block. So that is what I'm going to be mainly going with, the one where you're backing away from your opponent to block. But I did want to wrap up the manual blocking logic while we're here, because I didn't want to just leave it in there and not be functional. So just to still show you everything I've done regardless of your choice, I start manually blocking and start automatically blocking. They're separate functions now. And then I also have stop manually blocking and stop automatically blocking. All right. Then I also have a few new variables. If I scroll down, all the way down to the booleans, under is facing left. It doesn't matter where you put it, but that's where I put it. I've added two new variables. I've added one called bool is pressing backward. So we've been doing all these checks in our code to determine if we're moving left or right. For example, like, are you facing this direction, and then are you giving it this input? And that works. And I'm not even going to change that everywhere because it does work. But we don't need to be checking all that logic every time we're trying to block. It's confusing for us as the developer. It can cause issues in the game because maybe you are trying to press that direction, but we're limiting that because you're in some sort of stun. And we don't want to make this more complicated than it has to be. So what I really want to do is check if the player is pressing backward and then check if they are able to block. So I'm just kind of condensing some of our logic here by adding this boolean called is pressing backward. And then we can keep track of what we need to successfully block when pressing back from the attack that we're about to receive. Then I do have a boolean in here. Again, this is to determine if we are manually blocking or not, because the logic is different if we are manually blocking than if we are just, I keep calling it automatically blocking, but if we're just blocking when backing away. All right. And that's all you should need as far as variables go in the header file. If we go back to the fighter template character.cpp, I can set my values in the constructor. So I've set the is pressing backward and is manually blocking to false because neither of those are occurring when the character is created. And then in setup player input component, I did adjust the functions a little bit here. Just in case you want to use both, you can do the same thing that I'm doing here. Start and stop manually blocking, as opposed to start and stop blocking, because that's what they were in the past. Remember, these ones are the ones that get called when we press and release the button. So we specifically want the manual block here. And then I went to my start block and stop block functions and I changed the names. And then I also copied their logic and put these guys in. So these are all four of the functions. We'll go over the differences here in a second. All right. So for this guy, for start manually blocking, I have basically if the player can move and the combo state is equal to none. And the reason I check if the combo state is equal to none is because if the combo state is not equal to none, or perhaps in hit stun or being launched or something, we don't necessarily want to be able to manually block while we're in these other states, right? There's a punishment period, and it's in these stun times where you can't necessarily block because you have a number of stunned frames still. So we have to make sure that we're not currently being beat up or have stun frames or whatever. So, normally what I do, and specifically in this case, is I set combo state, or I check if combo state is equal to none before proceeding. And we went over that, I believe, 2 episodes ago, all this combo state stuff. So since this is start manually blocking, I set is manually blocking to true. Yes, we are manually blocking. We're pressing the button to block. The character state goes to blocking as well. And then I add the block input icon to the screen. This is something we've covered in our input stack episodes. Then I have start automatically blocking. We'll get to where we call this in a little bit, but all I do here is I check if we can move and if the combo state is equal to none. Again, because it's the same conditions, really. So we could call start automatically blocking because, say, we are pressing backward away from our opponent, away from the attack. But if we can't move or our combo state is not equal to none, again, we don't want to just automatically block. We are not in a state where we can block. We have to make sure that the player that is trying to block is able to block. Otherwise, it would be broken and you could never actually get anyone in a chain. All I do for this one is set the character state to be blocking. First of all, they're not manually blocking, so I don't really need to set that to true. You could set it to false here technically. However, I'm going to allow, for the sake of the template and the tutorial, I'm going to have a Boolean to determine if you want to manually block or automatically block so that you can turn it on and off. So for me, I don't need to do that. That'll be covered later. Then we have stop manually blocking. Quick note, actually. We don't need this add input icon to screen, in my opinion, because these input stack icons are supposed to be the inputs that the player put in. We already have the input for moving backward away from the opponent that will be put in. The player did not necessarily press a button to initiate the block. They were backing away. So even if it was intentional, I don't think we need to display the block icon. But if you wanted to, by all means, go ahead and do it. All right, now we have the stops. So stop manually blocking is what happens when we release the block button. So if we can move and the combo state is equal to none, we can stop manually blocking. Now, there's something to this. So we were doing this before because we didn't want to be able to just stop blocking while we were, in a combo, whatever. Mainly because we don't want to be able to reset these variables and change these states. But we don't necessarily want it to be equal to the combo state. They have to be equal to none either. So you could change it. If you want the player to be able to stop blocking when they, run out of hit stun, whatever, if they've released it during their hit stun, then you can check if the state is equal to a specific number of things. The problem is you don't necessarily want to just reset these values if it's, in those states. So this is something I'll cover a little bit more on when we get to the next combat flow episode, because there's things that I want to do with this and with our anim transitions that can fix a lot of these issues that could come up from this. Again, this is only for the manually blocking, so you don't have to worry about it for the automatic blocking. But we need to do some things to make sure that we aren't breaking the logic and allowing the blocker to take advantage of some flaws in our code to be able to attack sooner than they should be able to do. Otherwise, though, assuming this is just done correctly and the button is released after the combo state is none and they can move, then we just reset is manually blocking to be false again, and then we set the character state to be default. All right, and then in stop automatically blocking, it's pretty much what you can imagine. We do the same checks that we have done every time, and then we set the state to be default. Again, we don't need to do anything with the Boolean. All right. Now, the other thing we need to do here before we can get into the few adjustments to call start and stop automatically blocking is we need to determine if we're pressing the back button. Remember, we were checking for that to determine if we were pressing back away from the attack. So we have these move right functions, which determine if we're moving right or left. We've got a lot of logic in here from all the episodes, all the different things we've done. We have a section right here. This if statement in particular just determines if we're in basically the standing state and we're not already blocking all these other things, then we're moving this direction. I realized that I should just change around all my maps because I hate this axis thing. And so in a previous episode, we had set up is facing left, and we made that work. But I want to change this to be called is facing right now because I've adjusted all my maps to be the same and all my axes to be the same. And because of this, the next logic I'm about to show you is actually going to be more confusing if you don't change this name to is facing right. So I'm going to change it now. I'm going to go through it quickly. We already covered this, changing this. But basically, change the name everywhere. I did a find and replace to is facing right. So basically, I checked for is facing left. I use Control F to bring up this box. And then I click the little down arrow, type in is facing right. Make sure current project is selected. This will replace all instances of is facing left and convert them to is facing right in the code. If you click this one right here, this button on the right, this is replace all. So it will replace every instance in your code of is facing left with is facing right. Okay, so there's that. And then once you try and load the project, the Unreal project for the first time, you are going to get these errors. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to fix them all up right now. Is facing right. And make sure all these blueprints compile. These are all the ones that have issues. So I'm just going to show you a little bit about how I do it. At that point, all of our blueprints compile, and we can play the game. Now, the way you know that you've done this correctly, and for you, you might not even have to do this change, depending on how it's set up, to be honest. But if we scroll down here, we want to make sure that the logic and the Boolean name matches up with what we're actually seeing. So in this case, we have is facing right as the Boolean we're checking. You can see is facing right is correct for player 1. And then when they jump over, it is correct for player 1 as well because they're facing left, so they're no longer facing right. Is swapping correctly. And we want to make sure it's also right for player 2 just to be extra sure. Player 2 is this guy right here. You can see is facing right is currently disabled. It's false. And now it's enabled. It's true. And so that logic is correct. And sorry about that, guys, but now we can get back to the episode and what we are actually focusing on. Okay, so in our move right functions, we have logic to determine if we can move right, if we can put the icon on the screen, all these different things. And it will depend on the states we're in. So for now, all we really check is to see if we're blocking, if we can currently move left or right, and if we're pressing a direction while we're crouching. Although we can't currently crouch walk at the moment, we can determine if we're pressing left or right. And so we're going to change our logic a bit to not just, we don't want to have to check all this every time to know if we're blocking or not, which currently when we were doing our press backward to block, the way we were actually doing it is when we were colliding with a proximity or projectile hitbox, we were doing this if statement that I've commented out. And this is what you'll have in your code if you've been following the series to this point. But look at all this. Yes, I mean, it works. It is correct. But I'm just making it tied to this is pressing backward Boolean. It's not necessary by any means, but it just helps us keep everything in one spot. Instead of having to check all these and statements everywhere, we can check one single Boolean that we set in the actual function where we're moving, and we'll never have to worry about it again. Okay, so basically, if the character is moving right and the character is not facing right, then we know that we're pressing backward. We're moving in a direction we're not facing, which means we're going the opposite direction, which means we are pressing backward. So is pressing backward is true. Alternatively, if we're moving left and we are facing right, that's opposite again. So pressing backward is equal to true. Else, pressing backward is equal to false. And this makes sense because this else here basically means that either we are not pressing, left or right, or the value is less than this dead zone, so 0.001, something like that. And because of that, we are going to ignore the input anyway, so we're just setting is pressing backward to false. Now, technically, if you press both keys here, there could be some unintended results. We're going to actually disable that through a Boolean as well, but we're not going to do that yet. I have a few things I want to do with that, and there's no point getting into that now, especially with this being a longer episode. Okay. Now, the else to this if that we just put all this in, one of the things was if we're not crouching. So this is all for standing logic. For crouching logic, although we don't move the character, remember, we do want to be able to determine if they're pressing left, right, whatever, so that we know if they can crouch block. So because of this, we do the same logic that we did there in the same areas. So if can move and is crouching, if the value is right, that's what this is, even if we're not moving right. So down right, essentially. And we're not facing right, then we know we're pressing backwards, so we do true. If the value is left, or down left in this case, and we're facing right, then we know that we're pressing backward yet again. Lastly, if we're not pressing either of those, or these values fall below the dead zone thresholds, then we're not pressing backward. Set it back to false. Now, since we do have move right control, it is slightly different with dead zones and different things like that, and more things in the future, then we want to copy the logic here as well. So I won't go over it all again because it's pretty clear at this point, hopefully. But moving right, not facing right, is pressing backwards true. Left, right, true. Else, false. Right, left, true. Left, right, true. False. Okay. So hopefully that all makes sense. And at that point, we have everything we need to continue. All we have to do is make sure we're calling the right functions when we get hit by the right thing under the right circumstances. So you can see I've commented out these lines, and I was talking about these earlier. That's what this is pressing backward is meant to do. It's meant to clean this up. So I'm going to delete these lines and just replace it with if is pressing backward. And then instead of just setting the character state to be blocking, we can make this a little bit nicer by calling start automatically blocking. It helps us in a lot of ways. It first of all allows us to cut down on the places that we are setting our states. You want to kind of make everything that you were doing, every time you're going to block, go through the blocking functions. It just makes more sense. It cuts down on issues down the line that we have to look for. And now we have a function for it. So we can just call start automatically blocking for both of these. Collide with proximity hitbox and collide with projectile hitbox. All right. Now let's go to take damage. Now take damage we have a spot where we just take damage because we were unable to block an attack under any condition, which means high, mid, or low. And then we set the combo state to be stunned based on the hitbox height enum value that we have. And then we begin the stun. Well, this is good, but we need to be doing this for blocking as well, because currently what we had prior to this episode, we were not setting the hitbox height. We were just setting our num stun frames equal to the block stun frames of the hitbox and then calling begin stun. But now that we specifically need to have the state as blocking and the combo state to be the proper stun, so we know which type of block stun it is, in the else statement for your take damage, where we determine, yes, we were able to block that attack, we still want to grab the hitbox height because we still want to know where it was blocked from, so we know what block stun to go to. Could change the animation, the effect, or just logically, it might change different things about it. It could change the values. It could change what could hit afterward. So it is important to have this logic in here. But we still call begin stun after. Okay. And then in begin stun, it's the same as it has been. We just check the number of stun frames, and set can move to be false. I just realized that this was actually still checking against the float. Num stun frames is now an integer. So we can just actually check if this is greater than 0, just to clean it up. It's not technically necessary. You can do integer and float checks like that, so won't actually affect anything, but just to avoid confusion since it's no longer a timer, we can do that. And then I have a little bit of extra logic in the end stun, just to change the functionality for manual block versus automatic block, or manual block versus pressing backward to block. So that logic is essentially, this is the if statement that checks and sees, can we actually end stun, or are we in a state to return to idle, basically? And once we confirm that we were setting the character state to be default and setting the combo state to be none. However, if we are manually blocking, remember, I don't want you to have to return to the not blocking state in this case. So we're just going to set the character state back to be blocking. Else, if we're not manually blocking, then character state can go back to default as usual. In either case, we need the combo state to return to none once the stun is done with. All right, and now we're done with all the code changes. So we can go ahead and go back into the engine, and we can go into our blueprints, go into our animation blueprint, and we don't need anything in the event graph today, other than if you want to change some of your hitbox values to test these frames out. But we do want to adjust our blocking logic a little bit, just so, again, we can support manual and automatic blocking. So let me show you my states now. So walking backward to block is my blocking when pressing backward. Okay, my automatic block. That's what I keep calling it. And the transition rule is pretty simple. Basically, if we're in walking backward, to go to block, all we have to do is go to the blocking state, which is determined in the collided with proximity hitbox and collided with projectile hitbox function. I did unshare these rules. This was shared as the blocking rule, and I had block to idle as the return from blocking. I did unshare them now since manual block and regular block are separate. But block to idle is simply character state not equal to blocking. So once the stun is over and the block is finished, then we return to idle, and thus both our state and our animation can return to idle. I did technically leave these as shared transition rules, the blocking and return to blocking on the idle to manual block and manual block back to idle. However, since we are not actually using them in another spot, they don't need to be shared rules anymore. If you want to, you can just unshare them. They're slightly different now. Idle to manual block checks if you're manually blocking and the character state is equal to blocking to be able to go there. This is because manually blocking can be set under a few circumstances by pressing the manually block button, but it is possible that you get interrupted or you can't go to the blocking state for whatever reason. It gets stopped. And so we don't want to go to manual block unless we can both A, actually be in the blocking state, and B, we are pressing the button to manually perform the block. Then manual block back to idle. All I'm doing is checking if the character state or if the character reference is manually blocking not, basically meaning if it's not manually blocking, so we're not pressing the button anymore. We can go from block to idle. And the reason for that is because stuff I mentioned earlier in the episode where we are going to add a few additional transitions during the combat flow episodes. As long as the character is not manually blocking, we can return them to idle for now. We can put some further restrictions on it to make sure they aren't in specific states anymore before allowing them to do so. And there you go, guys. So now you can actually both manually block and automatically block to a point where it actually has purpose, and to where you can play around with the Blockstun and actually allow it to work, where you can, you know, receive a hit and it will perform the blocking animation and then trap the player there until the Blockstun is complete. This will help you work out advantages, disadvantages on different hits and blocks, and those things are really important. But I think it was important to clear up everything with the blocking before we go forward into the combat flow logic, where we actually mess with all the transition rules and making sure that everything can only go to the specified other states. Right now, pretty much everything goes from idle and not much else, but we're going to fix that up. So anyway, guys, that's all I got for you. So I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please subscribe. It does more for the channel and me than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I want to give a huge, huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for all the love and support. I am really, really enjoying this series, and every episode we get more clean, we get in a better spot, and I just really, really am getting excited about what else we can do with it. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.